The wind cut across the plain like an old blade, thin and steady, carrying dust in a pale ribbon that blurred the horizon. He lived where the land opened up and showed its bones. A house of rough-cut boards and a lean-to for the horse, a stove that sang when it was fed, a yard of packed earth and a fence that meant the world inside stayed put. For years he had kept to the small geography of his days. The woodpile, the well, the path to the low ridge where he watched storms gather. He had a habit of waiting for things to come to him, and the world had a habit of not asking permission. Silence suited him. It fit around his shoulders like a heavy coat and kept people at a distance the way a broad hat keeps the sun off a face. He moved with the careful economy of a man who had little left to risk. He also moved with a memory that cut as clean as the wind. The memory was a blackened thing buried under the floorboards of his thinking. A house with a single light, a woman's laugh snapped by a crack of bad luck, and a child's shoe left in the doorway where no child could ever return to it. He kept that memory folded. It made him steady and it made him small. He called no name for it. He answered no one about it. He simply kept on chopping wood and fixing what the weather took and lying awake when the moon was thin and thinking like a man who owed himself nothing but the next morning's chores. It was a life he could stand inside. It was safe because it asked him nothing of the heart. On a gray morning when frost had crusted the shuttered fields and the sun was a pale coin in a washed-out sky, he saw her at the edge of the treeline, a dark shape moving among the bare trunks, a woman hunched and gathering. She bent low and brought a bundle of sticks to her shoulder as if each stick was a small, honest thing and to gather them was to buy another hour of being. She had on what had been a good coat once, now threadbare at the cuffs, and boots that sagged with use. A child was folded into her shadow, small and wrapped in what she had. A blanket patched with dirt and stitches, a hat pulled down over a face that turned to sleep against the woman's chest more than to the road. The sight of them was a fact that did not fit into the map he had drawn for himself. He found his horse at the hitching post because he had walked that far by instinct, not because he had meant to. He cinched the saddle with the same slow hands he used to steady a plow and rode the western ridge down toward the treeline. The trees kept the wind from whispering at his ears. The horse's hooves made no noise but the soft tread into the pine needles, and the woman did not look up when he rode within a few yards. He unsaddled and left the horse tethered where there was shade and a chance of overnight, and he moved without hurry toward the wood-gatherer. There was something about the way she worked, close to the ground, careful with the child as if every branch might strike, that told him she would not be easily startled and that she would not thank him for being fast. He stood back and watched the slow economy of her world. How she preferred small bundles that could be carried. How she chose limbs that lay close by rather than stabbing into the standing dead. How she tested a piece of bark with her thumb to see if it would catch flame. He thought, briefly and against his inclination, that she could have come from any place where winter was sharp and hands were used more than words. He thought, then, of his stove and of the way he might have let his fire burn down the night before. He thought of the little pile of coals that needed adding. The decision to speak came like a cough. Sudden, necessary, unavoidable. He walked up and said, "You don't have to do that anymore." The sentence was simple and was finished before the woman had time to make a shape of its meaning. She straightened, defensively, and her eyes were quick and narrow like a hawk's assessment. For a heartbeat she looked at him as one takes the measure of a stranger who has stepped into a place where he does not belong. Her jaw tightened. The child stirred and made a small whimper like a dampened bell. She wrapped the blanket tighter, showing by the movement that she did not like strangers. There was suspicion in her face, not the quick anger of a woman who expected comfort, but the deeper, colder sort practiced by people who know how to make what they have last without help. She said nothing for a long time. The wind moved and touched them both the way it touched everything that morning, bare and honest and leaving tracks. He added, unasked and with the same flatness he had used to handle his own losses, "There's a stove, good wood. House is warm." That was all he offered because he had learned to keep gifts small and useful and to speak no more than a stable that needed fixing. He watched for the tiny betrayal of hope in her face, and there was something like it. An involuntary softening of her mouth, a quick blink like someone who had not been allowed to imagine small mercy. Still, she answered only, "I ain't saying nothin'. Just don't send me back." Her voice was rough and not without edge, a voice that had been kept in check for a long time. The phrase was a whole history, a short folded thing that meant more than its small words. He felt in his chest the old quickness of guilt. It came not as a blade but as a weight, and he shifted to take it on. He nodded. He stepped back a fraction, and the small distance he made was, oddly, the next thing in kindness he could manage. He would not seize, not claim, not demand. He left the time and the choice to her. She glanced at the horse and the man's hands, then at the ridge where the homestead squatted like a promise he did not know if he deserved. He could read, in the tightening of her shoulders, the line of choices she had been forced to make. Travel light, stay near resources, keep a child hidden from those who might take things people like her could not afford to lose. The woman moved to gather the last of her bundle with a kind of economy that made him think of people who could not squander breath. He watched as she finished, as she strapped the bundle across her shoulders, and he noticed the way the child's small hand held at her coat as if the too thin straps were a lifeline. He thought of his own hands and what they could do and what they could not. Steam rose from his nostrils in the cold air and the horse stamped impatiently. He could not let them go back into the world like that without offering something more. He said quietly, "If you want, you can come with me for a bit, just until the weather eases. There's food. There's fire." The woman looked at the house and then at him, and for the first time a human question seemed to rest in her face. She was not proud. She was not brash. She had a reserve grown from hard seasons. A woman like that only accepted help when the scale of need made refusal the same as harm to herself and to the child she carried close to her breast. She paused as if measuring distance. She took one step and then another, and the child sniffled awake and peered out with a half-closed gaze, brown eyes like a coal not yet stoked. The pair moved toward him the way a tide moves, inevitable and slow. He watched them until they came within a space where he could see the hollows at the woman's cheekbones and the way her fingers were raw from work. He saw the scent of wood smoke and river water on her hair. He thought of the time when there had been a house full of laughter and a child's shoe in the doorway and decided, in those tiny, practical ways that made a man act, to do what a man could do without asking too much of his heart. He opened his door for them and carried the first small bundle across the threshold with the solemnity of a man who picks up something sacred because it needs to be held. Inside, the room smelled like boiled coffee and the slow, faithful smell of the stove. He set the sticks on the hearth and built the fire with the exacting motions of someone who has kindled too many nights of their life. The woman stood near the doorway, clutching the child who warmed against her like a small animal, and she watched the man without making the motion of gratitude. She had gratitude in a private place, but she guarded it the way a person guards the only warm thing they own. He busied himself with plates and a kettle and the quiet acts that in his hands were larger than words. He pulled out a spare blanket folded under the bed. He rubbed at a patch of scuffed floor until it looked less tired. He put a chair on the porch where the sun caught it in the late afternoon and could be a place where someone would learn to wait without fear. The child, at first trembling, began to ease against the larger body of the room and of the man's steady movements. When the child looked up, it was at the stove and not at him, then at the pile of kindling as if the simple accumulation of sticks could, in time, be enough to count on. The woman moved slowly to the table and took a tin cup the size of her palm. She did not look at him when she drank. She did not have to. He could see the motion in her throat and the way her hand curled just enough to show the edges of the life she had been saving. It was late afternoon before any talk of direction came. He set a plate in front of the woman and the child and sat across from them. He did not ask a single pointed question. He had learned long ago that questions could be knives if they were asked too soon. He looked at the woman and said, in the plain voice that had carried him through years without another's business, "You can stay as long as you need." The woman's shoulders showed no relief. Relief would make her off balance. She kept being watchful. Yet in the small of her back something eased, and the child, feeling the difference in the room, began to speak in the small halting syllables of one who knows language is a tool and can be used to barter for safety. He thought of the rightness of the offer and of the wrongness of his cautious heart that would rather keep the past at bay. He told himself, in silence, that this was a small reparation for a life of losses he had hidden away. He would do what he could, and he would do it quietly. Days that followed were little and reliable as nails. The woman rose before dawn and swept the floor where the light fell thin and chalky. She dried the dishes and mended a sleeve with a needle that came out of his spare tin. She left in the early light to gather water and the first of the wood that came down with the gale, and she came back with a basket of what she had found. The child learned to walk between the man's boots, and the man learned to look for a small pair of shoes that might be left by the stove. The man began to wake less in the empty middle of the night and more at the sound of a small breath from the other bed. He found himself listening for a small footfall outside his door, as if it were a bell that marked him present. He did not make speeches. He did not try to coax a story from the woman. When she spoke, it was in ripples. A name slipped out once, like a warm stone dropped in the water and leaving a ring that widened across the quiet. Once she glanced at the ridge and said only, "My brother's land is near the river." She said it as if it were a fact from a map and then folded it back into herself. He learned the small arrangements of their days. He found the woman's methodical ways suited his own. She cut bread with a careful knife. She swept in the evening outside the door as if she were sweeping the steps into a place where something else would come later. She hummed small tunes when she thought no one listened, tunes that belonged in the kind of life where lullabies were barter and song a quiet currency. He grew used to the way she made coffee with the same steady hand as she had gathered wood. He always kept something on the shelf for her. It was a gentle economy, and it made the house work like a small machine. Still, there were moments when the old grooves of him showed. He would sit on the porch alone at dusk and watch the sun make a hand of light across the valley, and his jaw would tighten and he would straighten as if bracing against a wind he could not see. Once, he found the woman at the far end of the field, gathering a late scrap of wood that had fallen beyond the fence, and something in him, old and sharp, lifted him to his feet and drove him across the yard. He crossed the gate and stood near her with his hands in his coat pockets and said nothing that might scare her back into the world she had been keeping. She glanced up and their eyes met. His were set like a man who had been used to being the one who provided, and hers were tired but not defeated. A small, honest face carved in a way that, in daylight, revealed the story of nights that had been kept. He pointed then to one of his trees and then to the stack of supply behind the lean-to and motioned, without words, for her to take what she needed. She did so with a quickness that made him realize she had been counting the days until the next storm. He watched her move the logs like a man counting his own breath and understood, in a way that no confession could admit, that to offer a roof and a stove was to re-educate his own heart in the language of other people's need. It was work. It was not romance. It was the simple machinery of living that binds people together. A kettle boiled when it should be, a child given a warm blanket, a broken will mended before it becomes a ruin. Over weeks that turned into a long gray warmth of days, he felt the slow suture of life stitch him into a place he had thought he had left. He began to ask small questions about the woman's past. She answered in pieces, each one like a coin slid across a table. She had been moving with the child for a while, she said, keeping to places that were merciful. The name she used for the child was short and said once and never repeated except in the soft of her voice when the child slept. She did not tell him why she had been alone. It was not her silence he found most instructive but the shape of her caution. It seemed to say she had known too many hands that turned to claim and too few that stayed. And then, one evening when the sky was a flat sheet of pewter and the wind fell as if the world had gone to sleep, they heard a clatter outside and a voice that had the roughness of town. People had come. The sound was small at first, the scrape of boots, the murmur of voices. The woman stiffened and the child drew closer. He moved to the door and unlatched it in slow motion. On his porch stood 3 men with broad coats and the look of men who had done their business in other people's affairs. They were not sudden and they were not vicious with the speed of highwaymen. They carried themselves like men who were the crust of the town's enforcement and the edge of its mockery. One of them grinned like a man who has found a small prize. The woman's hand tightened around the child. The man on his porch said, without preface, "We hear there's a woman out of the river flats came through here, moved through with a kid. Thought it might be someone we know." His words were casual, but there was a knife in their bluntness. He had the look of a man who saw people as property, or as curiosities. The woman took a step back as if to put the house between herself and them. The man in front of him folded his hands and looked around the yard like a man counting what belonged to him. The three men laughed once like a small thunder, and their boots made the porch boards answer with a dull sound. He did not move at first. He looked at the men and then at the woman, and the simple architecture of his anger made him set his jaw. He had learned to keep his temper because a bad temper could set a house on fire in small ways, but when someone put another soul like an open question in public, his reluctance left him. He said, neutral and flat, "She's staying." The leader of the three took a step forward and his grin widened. "With you, huh? Bought and sold or just a handout? Ain't no one works here except you and your land." His tone was meant to poke for a response. They expected, perhaps hoped, that the woman would cower and that the man would shrink and that town rules would apply where the plain had none. The woman's jaw rose and she looked to him as if he would break for her. He didn't. He stepped not forward into brawl but forward into the space between decency and cruelty with his shoulders square. He said, quieter now and with the kind of iron that is shaped by long steadiness, "She's with me, not bought." Chosen. The whole porch seemed to hold its breath. The leader's grin thinned. The man who had meant to swagger now measured the weight of a man who would not move. The three men stood for a moment like they were arguing among themselves without words. Then the leader laughed a brittle laugh and said, "You always been soft, Miller? Letting folk move in? Might be you forgot how to keep what's yours." The woman made a small sound then, half fear, half scolding, and the child clutched the blanket as if for coals. The man who called himself Miller, because that was the name on the mailbox and the one used in people's mouths, felt the old memory he had carried lift like a shadow. He had been a man who did not like chores easy, but he had never wanted to be cruel. He set his jaw and said, with a voice that had been quiet too long and now carried a clear note, "If you ain't here for trouble, you can move on." The leader's eyes calculated like a gambler counting chips. For a tight minute, the three men measured consequences. Then they turned and walked away, their coats catching the wind like small sails. The porch felt hollow when they were gone. The woman watched them go until the last of their noise shrank into the plain where it would be eaten by gusts and distance. When the door closed behind them, she leaned against the jamb and the only sound was the child's breathing. He did not say anything because he knew words could break up what was fragile, and because the woman did not want an audience for her relief. She folded onto a chair and rested her head in her hands, and the house held them both the way a practice thing holds a broken pot while glue dries. That night, the man went out to the ridge and sat where the moon made a thin curl across the land and thought about the way his life had changed shape. The wind touched him and made him feel both like the valley and like a man who had found a place where he might stay. He felt, for the first time in a long while, the soft ache of something that might be called wanting, not as a demand but as a small growth of hope. He did not allow himself more than that. He kept the hope like a seed in a dark pocket. He did not till it nor speak of it. He put his hands in his pockets and felt the rough of the leather he had always kept and went back to the house where the woman sat under the lamp mending a child's sock with deliberate, tiny stitches. The child slept at her feet as if the world had become narrower and kinder. He sat in the chair across from them and let the quiet of the room settle like dust. The woman looked up and their eyes met like two careful animals. There was a thing that passed between them, a shared recognition that neither had been built for ease. He found himself thinking, with a small, clear resolution, that he would do what he could to keep her and the child safe because safety was a small but holy thing and because the memory under his floorboards had taught him mercies in a language he had not thought to speak. He did not speak of the past. He did not tell her that once he had lost a child on a night much like this. He only made a place at the table and kept it warm. He watched the woman lay out pieces for the child, cloth, a cup, a small tin that gleamed like a piece of the sun when the lamp touched it, and he understood that the measure of what he could do would be counted in such small utilities. Winter would be long. The world would be hard. But for the first time in a while, there was someone there who would learn with him the work of surviving together. He let that be enough for now. The winter held them in the way a hand holds a small bird, careful and relentless. Snow came thin at first, dusting the low scrub, then heavier, flattening the tracks that had led them to the house. Miller watched the land from the window with a slow, steady attention. He watched the sky for the same reasons he kept watch over the stove and the cellar. The woman learned to read his silences like another kind of weather. When he leaned in, when he let his shoulders drop, when he would stand at the threshold and listen to the wind before closing the door, she would understand there was nothing new to say. They moved around one another in rituals that were nearly speech. Firewood stacked by the back door. Water carried from the pump, breast high with cupped hands to keep the child from slipping. A kettle that sang at the same hour every evening. A blanket spread on the floor where the child could tumble without fear of breaking something old and sharp. The house settled into itself, as if it always had been meant to hold these three breathing bodies. The child began to learn habits that were not all fear. The child learned to lay out Miller's boots in a neat line by the stove. The child learned to wipe the edge of the table with a small, deliberate hand until it shone dull but clean. The child watched Miller as if he were practicing some simple kindness that could be done again, and then did it too over and over, as if the repetition would weave safety into the day. The woman watched them both, and sometimes, when she thought the night could not be taken for granted, she would take Miller's hand and press it for a heartbeat. He would not look up, but he would hold still. That small, silent acknowledgement was more than either had offered before. Miller had always kept to himself by design and accident. He had been careful to avoid promises he could not keep. The woman understood that. She had been careful in turn, keeping secrets folded tight, like her child's small shoes beneath the bed. But the house, warmed from its iron belly, and the steady presence of someone who left in the morning and returned in the evening, made the secret thin at the edges. She found herself telling Miller small things she had not told others. Once, while mending a sleeve by the lamplight, she let slip the name of the town where they had passed through the year before. He did not ask more. Once she hummed a lullaby to the child in the voice of someone who had learned to quiet a restless breathing. He heard it and, for a long time afterward, would stand with his hat in hand at the rail and listen to the sound of a song that had never been his. Winter is not quiet in the same way all at once. It had a way of bringing out the old world in men who were trying to forget it. One afternoon, late, when the light was the brittle color of a coin worn thin, a shadow moved along the far fence line. Miller saw it first. He said nothing. He walked outside with the slow gait of a man used to cold, boots sinking into crusted snow, and the three men from town came again. They came mounted, two on horses, one leading the third by the arm. Their faces had the kind of impatience that becomes sharper when a man believes he is owed an answer. They had coats that showed them to be town men still. They had the look of men who had never learned to keep their distance from other people's lives. "You said she was here," the lead man said, spitting into the snow in a small, tidy line. He did not know where to look. The child was inside, peeking through the curtain by the stove. The woman stood at the back of the doorway, coat snug, hands at her sides. Miller stood before the men with the slow, square jaw that had kept him to himself for so long. He did not like men who came to ask for what was not theirs. "She's with me," he said. The words were not loud. They did not have to be. They carried the weight of the winter and the plain, steady truth that had been spoken before. One of the men snorted. "You can't keep her, old man. She owes people. She runs and hides. That's trouble." Miller's hand was on the butt of the axe by the door. He knew the thing that could happen in a flash, how any small mercy could be overturned by a man with a quick temper and a feeling of being right. He set his jaw and did not reach for the axe. He did the harder thing. He put his hands where they could be seen and walked forward a single step. "She's not for sale," he said. "Not to you. Not to any of you." There was a shift. The second man took one cross-armed step forward like a dog screening the wind. "You can't hide folks from the law, Miller. You know that. We can have her back by sundown if we need to." "You'll have a hard time finding her by sundown," Miller answered. He kept his voice even as ice. He wanted the men to understand he was not trying to pick a fight he could not finish. He wanted them to know he would stand where he stood. The three men looked at one another for a breath, gauging how much trouble they wanted to invite. The lead man cursed softly and spat in the snow again, then swung his horse's head and led the others away. For a long minute after the tracks faded into the white, Miller stood looking where they had been and did not move. The woman came to his side, without asking, and they wrapped the child in a blanket together like a single, careful thing. That night the woman did not sleep much. She paced the small kitchen a little, moving a spoon, pausing by the stove, watching the little flame. When she sat close to Miller and the child. When she mended, her hands trembled at first, and then became steady. The top of her voice when she finally spoke was thin. "I've been followed," she said. Her words were not a complaint. They were a fact. "You told them nothing." Miller's hand found her shoulder and did not squeeze. It was a strange balm. She tilted her head against him without looking up. "I told them nothing," she said. Her eyes were wet but not ruined. She had gotten good, he thought, at keeping a thing from going to pieces. They made plans like slow, inevitable things. Extra food in the cellar. The child taught to fetch, then to bring without asking. Miller taught the child to fetch water in a pail that was not too big for a small hand. They practiced what to say if men came. Nothing. They would not run because running invited worse things. They would stand and not give the world the pleasure of panic. The woman thought of leaving twice, but the thought of the snow and the deep, empty roads closed over that plan. He would not be able to keep her if she left and found herself in another town where men like those three could track her with no trouble at all. The choice, she realized, had been made already by something older than both of them. The quiet space of a house that would not turn a child away. February loosened slowly into March, and with it came a thaw. The sun held a softer color. Mud replaced the clean, treacherous white. Miller repaired the fence with the patient, deliberate hand of a man who had fixed many things without asking for thanks. The woman put small tags of color in the house, a strip of cloth on the mantel, a bowl painted in a town she remembered, Little Claims. The child began to speak in small sentences that looped like birds around the edges of words they were learning. Each word the child said settled like a pebble in the place where Miller's grief lived. He had not thought it possible that laughter could ever be something that came from within his house again. It did. It came in the thin, bright way of a voice that had discovered a new thing and wanted everyone else to see it. They did not escape the past. It waited like frost in hollows and returned the day the woman went to the market in the town for a bolt of cloth she could not find in the village store. She went with Miller because she could not go alone. They took the cart. The child rode wrapped in a blanket and watched the trees move by. The town was a scatter of men and women who all seemed to know one another and to have decided where they would stand in that small community. Miller felt the old world press in, the look of men who remember your faults, the way a child's misstep will be noticed and become anecdote. They kept their heads down. They bought the cloth they needed in a shop with a proprietor who looked at them as if deciding whether they were trouble. It was the sort of overlooked place where a man could be stripped in a conversation and not notice until it was done. The woman moved through it with the economy of someone who has learned to take only what is necessary. They were crossing the common when a voice called, familiar and sharp, and it cut through the noise like the crack of a dry branch. It was the same lead man who had come to the house. He stood with others by the inn, smirking as if he had been waiting for the moment to catch them in the act of being ordinary. He did not look surprised. He looked triumphant, like someone who had found a knot and begun to pull. "You took her into your house, Miller," he said to the crowd. "Thought you'd hide her from those who have a right." The words were cheap, like coins dropped on the floor. People turned. Some looked with curiosity. Some looked with the small cruelty of a crowd that relishes a story with villains and heroes. Miller felt the familiar tug of old rage, the one that used to make fists quick and mouths sharp. He did not want to be angry in town. There was more to lose in a public place where knives and reputations were both traded like goods. The woman stepped forward, not because she wanted to, but because she had been pushed there by the little person who needed a voice larger than the one he had learned. She put her hand, slow, deliberate, on Miller's arm as if to anchor both herself and him. "It's our business," she said. Her voice did not wobble. It was clear and steady, and for the first time Miller saw how much ground she had taken back. "You have no right to take my child. You have no right to say where I belong." The lead man's mouth tightened. He looked at Miller for support like a dog seeking a master. Miller stood. He could have said the things that Byrne said them to show who he had been, but he did not. He said instead, "She's with me. She's not your claim. There is a place where townspeople will test a man they think they can push." The crowd leaned forward, folding like a tide. They pushed questions, hints, the weight of old gossip. Miller felt the pressure like weather. He did not raise a hand. He did, however, take the woman's hand in his. Not to hold her like something fragile. To tell her she could stand here. The child was quiet, clinging to her skirt. In the hush that followed, one old man in the crowd, who had known Miller years before, when his hands had been rough from honest labor, spoke up. "Leave him alone," the old man said. "He keeps to himself and doesn't ask for trouble. That's enough." A small thing, but it was the kind of small thing that matters. The crowd broke and dispersed like smoke. The lead man, having been shown that this was not his audience, grinned a sour grin and turned away. Miller, the woman, and the child stood together for a long heartbeat before walking away. They did not speak much on the road home. Miller's hand stayed on the wheel. The woman hummed under her breath, an odd little tune she must have learned from a lullaby. The child watched the trees. The small drum of the wagon wheels on the thawing ground was like counting, not of days but of small victories. They were through this day intact. Home had a way of reshaping a person. The stove seemed to warm more quickly upon their return. Food tasted plain and better for it. They sat at the table in a new alignment. The woman mended in the morning now, in front of the window where she could watch the road. She embroidered a small piece of cloth with the pattern of a rock and a leaf, something she said she would add to the mantle. Miller put the child's small shoes by the door each night as if it were a liturgy. The house gathered meaning like a barn gathers hay, in piles, without fuss, until it could not be mistaken for anything else. A storm came in late March with a quick, brutal turn. The wind heaved at the house in gusts that whistled like a thing that had learned to speak. The child woke in the night with a cough, a thin, rasping sound that made the woman's hands tremble. She took the child to the stove, held him close, and felt a prick of heat that made her think of fevers and doctors and the sort of small things that can unravel life quickly. Miller woke at the sound, as if drawn by a bell. He was by her side without asking, a quiet god of small remedies. He made tea with thick slices of lemon. He kept the fire steady. He took the child's forehead with the practiced hand of someone who had known other harm. The cough deepened, and the child's breathing grew short. The woman's face went to stone, and the room filled with a tight, bright fear she had not shown since the day she had first come to his door. Miller did not spare himself panic. He bent to the child and did not try to hide his fear. He wrapped the boy in a blanket and sat with him on his lap, hands steady as oaks. He had been the one to bury a life before. He knew grief's geography. He felt the woman's fingers on his shoulder like a score of small weights. "We'll keep him," he said, speaking to the room and not to anyone in particular. "We'll keep him warm," his voice cracked, once, and the woman's hand tightened in response. "We'll fetch the medicine," he added. The town was too far for a long journey in a storm, and the roads were mostly illusions under fresh, white paint. So he went anyway. He wrapped his coat around his shoulders, closed the door with a practiced hand, and walked into the weather. The snow took at his boots, cut at his cheeks. The wind was a vast mouth that tried to swallow his warmth. He held the reins tight, his hands stinging, and he thought of the child's small cough, of the thinness of flesh. The town's doctor had been a study in patience years ago. The doctor would know what to do. He would know if the cough was simple or the sort that grows teeth. Miller walked until his breath burned and his hat was flung low from his forehead. He stepped into the doctor's doorway like a man bearing a small memory, and the doctor took him in without question. The doctor wrapped a handkerchief and some medicine into a pot, then nodded at Miller as if he had been expected. "Take care," he said, and there was no counsel in it more than the basic, blunt truth. Miller fetched coal and a bottle and the powder that promised rest, and he went back to the house with a gait that had a new, ferocious steadiness. He opened the door to the bright smell of the stove and the sound of the woman humming like a hymn. He fed the child the medicine with a spoon that trembled at the edges. The child drank it as if it were the most necessary thing in the world. The fever burned for a long night, then broke like ice beneath the sun. The child's breath smoothed and the cough thinned until it was little more than a shadow. In the morning the child sat by the window and watched the thaw with serious, bright eyes. The woman let out a laugh that was like a released breath. That illness settled something in all of them. It taught the woman how much she trusted Miller to go into the world and come back with something necessary. It taught Miller how much he would move, even when the roads were treacherous and the world could hurt him. It taught the child that there were two adults who would not let anything happen to him if they could help it. After that night, the woman's manner softened in ways that were not quick or boastful but steady. She made tea and left it by the rail for Miller when he returned from the field. She spoke first sometimes, small things that tested the comfort of speech and found that the house could hold them. The child learned to say Miller's name in a way that made the old grief shrink at the edges. By the time spring had firmed into a promise, the land itself seemed to approve. The fence they mended stood straight. Spring came in with the smell of wet earth and the sound of life testing the air. The three of them worked at the homestead like people who had discovered a thing by accident and decided to care for it. Miller taught the woman how to set seeds in prepared soil. She showed him how to tend the child beyond his immediate needs like a woman who had learned the edges of protection. They found a rhythm where the house became a thing of both their hands, not a refuge they took turns guarding. They were not lovers in the swooning sense of storybooks. They were closer in the way a pair of workers become one team, each watching for the other's misstep, each taking up slack without ceremony. The small domestic acts, cleaning, cooking, putting a child's hat on straight, became a language of their own. The town's men did not return in force. Rumors died where nothing fed them. Sometimes a stranger would ride by and look at the house as if asking permission to judge. Sometimes neighbors would come and borrow tools and linger on the porch as if the house were some quiet monument that made a good place to rest. Miller would stand by the stove or the fence and watch them go. He had become something like a keeper, which was not the same as a man who kept his grief under the lock of his chest. He had learned to let others see him keep things, and that was redemption of a certain sort. One evening, at dusk when the light makes the world into a clean, honest shape, the woman lingered on the porch as Miller took down the last of the supper plates. She had in her hand a small, plain plank of wood that had been sanded smooth. She placed it on the table and set a small, crooked rocking chair on top of it. It was an old thing she had found in the barn when she first came. A little cradle rocker the child could sit in, the same piece that had once belonged to another household. She handed it to Miller with the awkwardness of someone offering a promise in a language she had not often used. He took it with both hands. "It's not much," she said. Her voice was soft, and the light turned it to something like an offering. "It's steady," he answered. He set the little rocker against the mantel. It nestled there as if it had always belonged. The child crawled into it and rocked with the confident motion of someone who has been warmed by all the right things. For a long time they sat and watched him rock. The silence was a feeling like a held note in music, full of expectation, heavy with the sound of what could be said but did not have to be. In the months that followed, life wore the soft covers of small certainties. A garden took root in the newly tilled soil. They fixed the roof together, side by side, without a word perhaps for an hour at a time, and then a small exchange of clumsy laughter. The woman taught the child to tie boots, to sew a button, to look up when answering a stranger. Miller taught the child how to split wood without fear. They grew into each other in the way that a house grows into a home, slowly with the accumulation of things that are not flashy but essential. There came, at last, a day bright with the taut promise of summer, when Miller took the woman by the elbow and led her to the hill behind the house. He had brought nothing, said nothing. They walked in silence, each step a sentence without words. On the hill there was a small headstone he had cut and set years before for those he had lost. He had never told her about that grave. He had not told anyone. He had thought the memory was a thing that would weather like the rest of him, private and unremarkable. He stood before the stone and laid his hand against it. The wind pushed their hair across their foreheads. She stood beside him and did not ask. She had seen enough of sorrow to know when it was time to be still. The child clutched a small flower he had found and pressed it into the dark at the base of the stone. The woman's hand found Miller's, turned it, and held it. He felt her fingers cold and sure. He felt them tell him without words that it was all right to wear the scars he had. "He was my other life," Miller said finally, not looking at her. The sound was not a confession so much as a letting of the air in a long-held bellows. "I lost them," he said. "I thought it was the end." He paused then, and when he turned, when he looked at her, his face was not different, but it was softer. The years had taught it how to settle. She did not pat the pain away. She placed her palm over his in a way that made the world patient. "It wasn't the end," she said. He let the words fall into the pale air between them and did not argue. He had, in a way, found a way out of that end. She had, in a way, found a place that had room for more than she had thought possible. They returned to the house with the light of the late afternoon making long shadows. The child ran ahead to gather stones by the stream. They walked with the loose, comfortable manner of people who have come to consider one another home. At the door, Miller paused and put his hand on the latch, then looked back at her and said in a voice brittle with an honesty that shocked even him, "Stay." She looked at him, not surprised, not moved in the theatrical way of story, but with something like recognition. "I already have," she said. In the quiet that followed, the child set down his stones and climbed into the little rocker. The three of them sat at the table to eat, hands messy with jam, laughter small and spontaneous and true. The house seemed, at last, to reflect them rather than merely shelter them. The stove hummed and the kettle over it made a sound like a small, contented animal. Outside, the land stretched to where fences met the high sky. Inside, their lives had folded together not with the dramatic thrust of love at first light, but with the slow, deliberate acts of two people who had been hardened by the world and had, against habit and expectation, kept one another. Years will tell of a home in the way that sunlight tells the color of paint. The fence held better. The garden grew richer. The child learned the shape of a plow and the way a story can be told in the rhythm of a day. Miller grew older in a softer, easier way. He was not the lonely man he had been when winter first set that old, hard face of his. He laughed more. The laugh was like logs on a fire, coarse and warming. The woman's coat acquired patches of color. She kept a small cupboard of her belongings, and in it she tucked a scrap of the cloth from the town, stitched into the shape of a leaf. Sometimes, when the child slept and the stove was merely breathing, they would sit together without speaking, the way people do who share a room. Their hands would find each other without needing an excuse. A year later, in the soft light of another spring, the woman and Miller stood on the porch with the child between them. The little rocker sat where they had left it, its paint rubbed thin by constant use. He was older now by a season and a head taller, his voice catching on new words. A neighbor passed by carrying a basket and tipped his hat. The three of them watched the road, the quiet and ordinary world that had once seemed like a place you had to cross alone. They were not the sort of family that would become the subject of saloons and songs. They were not flashy. They were tacit and solid, like wood beams and stones. They had come to a place where silence did not mean emptiness but meant the kind of contentment that is heavier and truer than most boasts. Miller carved the initials of the child on the inside of the mantel some nights, a small, private thing. The woman embroidered seeds into the cloth she had kept, adding color where once it had been plain. If you had pressed the village and asked who kept the land right, you would have heard half-true stories because people tell about the world in what's convenient. But they would also have said, if they had a heart for truth, that there was a house on the next hill where a man had learned how to keep a promise, and a woman had learned to accept steadiness, and a child had learned what it is to be safe. The years will fold over any life like the pages of a book pressed under a hand. Things hide and reveal themselves under the pressure of time. Miller's hair shaded into silver at the temples. The woman's hands lined like the map of a life lived. The child's laugh was a sharp, bright thing they both guarded jealously. They were not untouched by sorrow. Storms came and took some of their crops. The neighbor's cow wandered off and was lost one season. But none of these things pierced that held place. They were small punctures on the skin of something whole. One evening, much like the first when the woman had come to his door, Miller stood at the window and watched the horizon where sky and land meet like two old friends who do not need much conversation. The child had been sent to bed early with a story about a fox and a moon. The woman moved in the kitchen with soft steps, her hands making the tea like a ritual. Miller set his hat on the peg and walked to the mantel. On it, among small tokens, sat the little rocker. Its paint faded and cheerful. He touched the carved initials he had set inside the mantel. He pressed his thumb to the wood and felt the warmth of the years. Silence lay over the house the way a good quilt covers a bed. It was not empty. It was full of things that had been said by doing rather than by speech. He sat in his chair, the one by the stove he had always favored. The woman came and sat across from him, and the child crept over and climbed into his lap. The three of them, in that small circle of warmth, formed a picture that belonged to a simple world. Miller closed his eyes, and when he spoke, his words fell into the room like a small rain. "We did all right," he said. He did not need to list the ways. She nodded, a smile tugging at one corner of her mouth. Outside the wind blew, a soft, indifferent thing that moves on without much regard. Inside, the house hummed with the steady life the three had built together. From dust and silence grew a home. From closed hearts grew a family. Their days would remain ordinary and full in the quiet way of people who have chosen to be present for one another. When the road is long and the world is cold, it is these small, steadfast things that matter. A warm stew at dusk, a hand left in the night, a small rocker that holds a child's dream. We'll see you again, where silence means home.